Greetings from MWN.com. Dr.M.Wilson, formerly Vice Principal and Head of Department of Commerce, Scott Christian College, Nagercoil is delighted in presenting this session. Thank you. Please subscribe the channel MWN.com. Aggregate demand and supply. Aggregate demand and supply are macroeconomic concepts that explain how the total demand and supply for an economy interact. Aggregate demand is the total amount of spending on goods and services in an economy. Aggregate supply is the total amount of goods and services that producers are willing to sell. The concepts of aggregate demand and supply model are long-run aggregate supply, short-run aggregate supply and aggregate demand. 1. Long-run aggregate supply, LRAS. It is a measure of a country's long-term national output, and it is not affected by short-term changes in supply. But LRAS is affected by long-term factors like population, technology, and resources. 2. Short-run aggregate supply, SRAS. It is the relationship between the price level and the amount of goods and services that firms are willing to supply in the short term. Short-run aggregate supply is based on the assumption that prices and wages are fixed or sticky, and it means they don't change. This is because companies have fixed costs, such as rent agreements, wage contracts, and regulated prices. In the short run, it is not possible for companies to build new factories quickly to meet demand. Hence, they must use their existing infrastructure, technology, and equipment. Factor prices, technology, labor productivity, availability of factors of production, government rules, taxes, and subsidies can shift SRAS. Short-run aggregate supply also shows that there's a short-run trade-off between inflation and unemployment. Higher inflation leads to more output, which is associated with lower unemployment in the short run. 3. Aggregate demand, AD. Aggregate demand is a measurement of the total amount of demand for all finished goods and services produced in an economy. It is also expressed as the total amount of money exchanged for those goods and services at a specific price level and point in time. Aggregate demand is calculated through the following equation: AD equals C plus I plus G plus NX, where C represents consumer spending on goods and services, I represents investment spending, G represents government spending, and X represents net of imports and exports. If the export exceeds import, it means inflow of money to the economy. If the import exceeds export, it means inflow of money to the economy. Representation of LRAS, SRAS and AD. The concepts of LRAS, SRAS and AD can be graphically represented in 3 graphs as follows. X-axis of the diagram represents real output and Y-axis represents price level. It is known from the diagram that in long run the supply remains constant. This is due to the fact that the firms utilize the resources to the maximum and also it attains the level of maximum demand. Hence, the long run aggregate supply will not be affected by the changes in price level. X-axis of the diagram represents real output, that is real GDP, and Y-axis represents price level. It is known from the diagram that in short run the supply increases. The short-run aggregate supply curve has a direct proportion to the price level. The main difference between nominal GDP and real GDP is that nominal GDP is based on current prices, while real GDP is adjusted for inflation. X-axis of the diagram represents real output, that is real GDP, and Y-axis represents price level. It is known from the diagram that the aggregate demand has an inverse relation to price. It means that increase in price level impacts the decrease in aggregate demand. But decrease in price level impacts the increase in aggregate demand.